Someone needs to ask the question that every single person watching that game was thinking out loud. Are we watching professional women's basketball, or did somebody accidentally broadcast an NFL preseason game with no helmets, no pads, and absolutely zero regard for human safety? Because what DiJonai Carrington just did on national television was not a basketball play. It was not aggressive defense. It was not competitive physicality. It was a full-contact, gridiron-style assault on a defenseless player. And the entire sports world is sitting here with their jaw on the floor, trying to process what they just witnessed. And here is the part that makes this whole situation genuinely unbelievable. We thought the WNBA would step in. We thought the public outrage after the Sophie Cunningham incident would be enough to force a change in behavior. We thought, at minimum, the sheer embarrassment of being called out on national television would make her think twice. We were completely and utterly wrong. Because DiJonai Carrington did not dial it back. She did not reflect. She did not adjust. She laced up her shoes, walked onto that hardwood, and decided tonight was the night she was going to make things significantly worse. And that is exactly what happened. 2 more flagrant fouls, a complete psychological breakdown on the court, a social media post that poured gasoline on an already raging fire, and then, the moment that nobody saw coming, she turned her back on her teammates and stormed straight down the tunnel in the middle of a live national broadcast. The fallout has been instantaneous, it has been catastrophic, and it is still unfolding right now as you are watching this video. The entire league has turned on her. Her career is hanging by the thinnest thread imaginable. And the one person who tried to warn everybody this was coming? Sophie Cunningham, who was laughed at, dismissed, and called a complainer. She has just received the most complete and total vindication in recent WNBA history, and she did not even have to lift a finger to get it. This is the full story. Every moment, every reaction, every consequence. Let's get into it. To truly understand the scale of what happened, you have to go back to the exact moments that broke the internet wide open. Because this was not a one-time lapse in judgment. This was not a player getting caught up in the heat of the moment during a single chaotic sequence. This was a pattern playing out in real time on national television in front of millions of people who could not believe what they were watching. The first incident set the tone immediately. DiJonai Carrington was not chasing a loose ball. She was not contesting a shot. She was moving off the ball, away from the play, and she delivered what can only be described as a targeted hit. We are not talking about incidental contact in the paint where bodies collide naturally during the flow of the game. We are talking about lowering the shoulder, dropping the weight, and driving through another player with the kind of force you would expect to see from a safety laying out a wide receiver coming across the middle of the field. It was a blindside hit. The player never saw it coming, and the moment it happened, the broadcast booth went completely silent. That silence said everything. These are commentators who talk for a living. They fill every second of dead air with analysis, color commentary, and reaction. But what they just watched left them completely speechless, staring at the monitors trying to make sense of what their eyes had just told them. Because there is no basketball explanation for what just happened on that floor. None. There is no defensive scheme, no coaching philosophy, no interpretation of the rulebook that makes that play acceptable. And then came the second look, the slow-motion replay that made everything dramatically worse. Watch the right hand. It goes toward the ball, which is the one part of this that could theoretically be called an attempt at a play. But then watch the left hand. That left hand comes up and connects directly with the face of a defenseless player. And the most damning part of all, the body language immediately after. Hands go up, the universal gesture of innocence, the "I didn't do anything" pose that every dirty player in the history of professional sports has used in that exact moment. Except the camera caught everything, the replay caught everything, and the entire world watching at home caught everything. This is not a one-game anomaly either, and that is the critical context that makes this so much more serious than a single bad night. Game after game, there's a pattern emerging that is impossible to ignore. The same swatting motion, the same follow-through that always seems to end with someone else's face absorbing the contact, the same hair-pulling incidents, the same chasing players down from behind. When you can build a highlight reel of a single player doing the same category of dangerous thing across multiple games against multiple opponents, that is no longer a mistake. That is a tendency. And a tendency like that, left unchecked in a professional sports league, is genuinely dangerous.
But that was only the beginning of what would become the most chaotic night in recent WNBA memory. Here is the thing about what happened when the referees finally made the call. The flagrant fouls were coming. The evidence was right there on the floor, visible to everyone in the arena and everyone watching at home. The officials, who by almost universal agreement had been giving Carrington far too much benefit of the doubt throughout this season, finally had their backs completely against the wall. There was no more room for interpretation. There was no angle from which this could be described as accidental. The whistle blew. The flagrant fouls were called, and that is the moment where this night could have ended badly, but salvageably. It did not end that way. When a player gets called for a flagrant foul, especially a player who has been in this exact conversation before, the only acceptable response is to take the call, walk to the bench, and let your teammates and coaches handle the situation. Accept the consequence, demonstrate some degree of self-awareness, and give the league and the public at least some reason to believe there is accountability happening in real time. That is the moment where careers are either protected or permanently damaged. It is not about the foul itself anymore. It is about the response to the foul. DiJonai Carrington chose chaos. What witnesses described from the floor of that arena in the moments following the call is a complete and total loss of composure. Not frustration, not disappointment, not even the kind of heated argument with officials that basketball fans have seen 1,000 times and generally forgive. This was something different. Arms flailing, screaming directed at the officials that was clearly audible to people sitting in the lower bowl of the arena. The kind of behavior that makes everyone in the building deeply uncomfortable because it has crossed the line from competitive emotion into something that does not belong on a professional basketball court. And then she was gone. Before the officials could even finalize the penalty, before her coaches could reach her, before her teammates could form any kind of wall between her and the exit, Carrington turned her back on every single person in that building and marched straight down the tunnel. She walked away from her team. She walked away from the game. She walked away from the thousands of fans who paid money to be there, on a live national broadcast in the middle of a game that still had time left on the clock. She quit. That is the word people are using, and it is hard to argue against it. When the consequences of your own actions become more than you can handle in the moment, and your response is to physically remove yourself from the situation by leaving the building, that is quitting. There is no softer way to frame it. And in professional sports, at the highest level of the game, that kind of exit does not get forgotten. It gets replayed. It gets analyzed. It gets talked about for years. If storming off the court had been the end of it, the conversation today would still be overwhelmingly negative. The fouls, the meltdown, the tunnel exit, all of that was already more than enough to generate the kind of controversy that follows a player around for the rest of their career. But Carrington was not finished, because somewhere between the tunnel and the locker room, she picked up her phone. And she posted, "White privilege." Let that sit for a second. In the immediate aftermath of being ejected from a professional basketball game for 2 flagrant fouls that the entire world just watched on national television, the public statement she chose to make was to suggest that the reason she was being held accountable was because Sophie Cunningham is white. That is the explanation she offered. That is the narrative she decided to push in real time while the game was still being played, while her teammates were still on the floor, while the sports world was still processing what had just happened.
The reaction from media figures across the political spectrum was swift, and in many cases, it was more focused on that tweet than on the fouls themselves. Dave Portnoy at Barstool Sports made the point that resonated with a significant number of people watching this unfold. The ejection, while controversial and worth debating, was defensible given the footage. That part of the story had two legitimate sides. But the tweet removed any remaining ambiguity, because the suggestion that accountability in professional sports is determined by the race of the player being fouled is not a sports argument. It is a completely different kind of statement, and it shifted the entire conversation in a direction that Carrington almost certainly did not anticipate. What made the media response particularly notable was what certain major outlets chose not to focus on. Coverage that spent significant time debating whether the flagrant foul calls were justified, whether the officiating had been consistent all season, whether the reaction from fans was proportionate, managed to almost completely sidestep the social media post that had set the internet on fire within minutes of being published. The selective coverage became its own story, with viewers pointing out the contrast between how certain outlets framed the incident versus what had actually been said publicly by the player herself. The Barstool commentary was pointed about this specifically. You can have a conversation about officiating consistency. You can debate whether the calls were the right ones. But when you publicly attribute your ejection to the race of the player you fouled, you have introduced something into the conversation that does not go away quietly. And the algorithms do not care which outlet covers it or ignores it. The post was out there. The screenshots were everywhere, and the discourse exploded in every direction simultaneously. By the time the final buzzer sounded on that game, something had fundamentally shifted, not just in the public conversation, but inside the professional basketball community itself. Because the criticism that followed did not come exclusively from fans, from media personalities, or from political commentators looking for an angle. It came from within the sport itself. Current players, former players, people who have spent their careers in this league and have a direct stake in its reputation and its future. The WNBA front office, which by most accounts had been operating in a kind of protective crouch around Carrington throughout this entire controversy, suddenly found itself with nowhere left to hide. You cannot defend two flagrant fouls called on national television. You cannot spin a tunnel exit that millions of people watched happen in real time. You cannot gaslight a fan base that has the replay queued up and ready to go on their phones at any moment. The commissioner's office, which had spent months allowing the narrative of intense defense to do a lot of heavy lifting, was now facing a situation that demanded an actual response. Fans are not waiting patiently for that response either. Reports indicate that the WNBA front office has been flooded with emails, messages, and social media pressure demanding a significant multi-game suspension without pay. This is not the casual complaining that leagues can usually absorb and move past. This is organized, sustained, and loud. The people sending those messages are the same people who buy tickets, who subscribe to the League Pass, who drive the viewership numbers that determine whether the WNBA's television deals remain valuable. And they are making it very clear that there is a line, and it has been crossed. The narrative surrounding Carrington has undergone a transformation that is going to be extremely difficult to reverse. For months, the framing around her style of play was that she was a physical, aggressive defender who played on the edge. That framing served her reasonably well as long as the individual incidents could be separated from each other and treated as isolated moments. That approach is no longer available. When you have enough incidents to build a comprehensive highlight reel, when you have enough instances across enough opponents that a pattern is undeniable, the edge of physicality framing collapses completely.
She is no longer being described as a fierce competitor. The language being used across sports media, fan forums, and professional commentary has shifted to words like liability, dangerous, toxic. Those are not words that any professional athlete wants attached to their name, and they are extraordinarily difficult to shake once they take hold in the public consciousness. The basketball world has drawn a clear line.
Either the WNBA takes meaningful action or it risks losing a significant portion of its audience permanently at a moment when the league cannot afford that kind of damage. There is a layer to this story that the mainstream sports media has been visibly uncomfortable addressing directly, but it has been present throughout this entire saga, and it cannot be ignored if you want to understand why this controversy has generated the kind of heat that it has. The WNBA exists at a complicated intersection right now, one where questions about eligibility, about gender, and about the league's identity have become part of the broader cultural conversation, whether the league wants them to be or not. Commentators from various perspectives have pointed out that the league's own collective bargaining agreement includes language specifying eligibility criteria, and that the ambiguity around how those criteria are defined in a changing social landscape has created an opening for political figures and commentators to inject themselves into conversations about the sport in ways that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. This is speculative territory, and it is worth being clear that what various commentators are saying represents their opinions and interpretations rather than established fact. But the debate is happening, loudly and publicly, and the Carrington situation has become one of the flashpoints through which these larger arguments are being channeled. Several prominent voices have made the argument that the WNBA's hesitation to take clear and consistent disciplinary action has contributed to an environment where the league becomes a target for exactly this kind of external political commentary. The suggestion, framed as commentary rather than conclusion, is that consistent accountability and rule enforcement would remove some of the oxygen from the political fire that has been burning around the league. Whether that analysis holds up is a matter of genuine debate, but the fact that the Carrington situation is now being discussed in the same breath as questions about the league's eligibility rules and cultural positioning tells you something significant about how far this story has traveled from a single flagrant foul call. The Florida Attorney General weighing in publicly is a data point worth noting without overstating. Political figures inserting themselves into professional sports controversies is not new, but when that insertion happens specifically in the context of a player who has become a lightning rod for these broader cultural debates, it signals that the story has moved well beyond the sports section. And once a story reaches that level, it develops its own momentum that the league and the players involved have very little control over. Now we get to the part of this story that has a certain undeniable poetic quality to it. Because through all of the chaos, through all of the fouls and the tantrums and the social media explosions, there is one person who has been proven completely and totally correct. And she did not need tonight to say a single word to make that point. Cast your mind back to the Sophie Cunningham incident, the brutal, unprovoked hit that started this entire controversy. Cunningham did not simply absorb the foul and move on. She did something that required genuine courage in the current sports media environment. She stepped in front of the microphones and she said clearly and directly that this behavior was dangerous, that it was escalating, and that if the league did not intervene in a meaningful way, someone was going to get seriously hurt. She named the problem specifically. She described the pattern she had observed. She called for accountability before things got worse. The response from the media was not kind.
She was called a complainer. Her warnings were dismissed as sour grapes from a player who had been outplayed. Commentary pieces were written explaining why Carrington's style of play was simply aggressive defense and why Cunningham's reaction was disproportionate. Social media piled on with the kind of coordinated mockery that is specifically designed to make someone regret speaking up in the first place. The message being sent was clear: stay quiet, take the hit, and do not make this into something bigger than it needs to be. Sophie Cunningham did not retract what she said. She did not apologize for saying it. She let the record stand. And then, tonight happened. Every single thing Sophie Cunningham warned about was proven correct on national television in front of millions of viewers. The escalating physical aggression, the repeat incidents, the lack of accountability enabling worse behavior, the targeting of defenseless players, all of it, exactly as described, playing out in real time. Carrington's complete meltdown after the ejection was essentially a live demonstration of everything Cunningham had tried to explain to a media establishment that had no interest in listening. The vindication is total. It is complete. And the fact that Sophie Cunningham got to watch it happen from a distance without having to say a single additional word, without having to relitigate the argument, without having to defend herself against another wave of criticism, makes it the cleanest possible outcome for a player who was treated unfairly when she chose to speak the truth. The player who targeted her is now the most talked about cautionary tale in the WNBA. The player who was mocked for speaking up is now the person everyone is saying was right all along. History has a way of settling these things, and in this case, it settled them remarkably quickly. The question sitting at the center of everything right now is straightforward. What does the WNBA actually do? Because the league's response to this moment is going to define how it is perceived and talked about for the rest of this season and well into the next one. A slap on the wrist fine does not work here. The situation has gone far beyond the point where a token financial penalty sends any kind of meaningful message. The fans who are flooding the front office with messages are not going to be satisfied with a number that represents a small fraction of a game check. The players who have spoken out are not going to be quieted by a statement that uses the phrase, "We take this matter seriously," without any substantive action attached to it. The media, which is covering this story from every conceivable angle, is going to hold the league accountable for whatever decision gets made. A significant multi-game suspension without pay is the minimum that the current moment demands. That is not a punitive desire. That is simply an acknowledgement of the scale of what happened and the league's responsibility to set a standard. 2 flagrant fouls in a single game, followed by a complete breakdown of professional conduct that included publicly abandoning your team mid-game on live television, followed by a social media post that inflamed an already explosive situation. Each of those things alone would warrant serious consideration. Together, they represent a crisis that requires a crisis-level response. Beyond the immediate disciplinary question, there is Carrington's actual career trajectory to consider. She is young enough that this does not have to be the defining chapter of her professional life, but the window for course correction is not unlimited. The reputation being built right now is being built in real time, in full view, and it is being built out of material that is very hard to walk back. Dangerous, liability, toxic, those labels attach themselves to careers in ways that agent meetings and PR strategies cannot fully undo. The path back from where she is right now requires something that has been completely absent from this entire situation: genuine accountability. Not a forced statement, not a carefully worded apology drafted by someone whose job is to minimize damage. An actual reckoning with the pattern of behavior that has led to this moment. Whether that happens is genuinely unknown. What is not unknown is the fact that the WNBA is watching its next move very carefully, and so is everyone else. Step back from the individual incidents for a moment and look at what this entire saga reveals about where the WNBA is right now as an institution. The league is in a fascinating and genuinely precarious position. On one hand, it has never had more visibility. The Caitlin Clark era has brought eyeballs to women's basketball that the league has been trying to attract for decades. Television ratings that would have been unimaginable a few years ago are now a regular part of the conversation. Sponsors are paying attention. Media coverage has expanded dramatically. On the other hand, that expanded platform means that every controversy is bigger than it used to be. Every incident plays out in front of a much larger audience. Every failure of accountability gets scrutinized more intensely. The same visibility that has given the league its greatest opportunity in years also means that moments like this one do real and measurable damage in a way that similar incidents might not have done 5 years ago when far fewer people were watching. The Carrington situation has exposed something that the league genuinely needs to address, not just the specific question of one player's conduct, but the broader question of how physical play is governed, how accountability is enforced, and how the league communicates its standards to the players, the officials, and the public simultaneously. A league that allows a pattern of dangerous behavior to develop over multiple games across multiple opponents before finally being forced to act by the sheer magnitude of a single night's events is a league that has a systemic problem with consistency. And consistency is the foundation on which trust is built. The fans who have been screaming about this for weeks are not wrong. The players who have spoken up about safety and accountability are not wrong. The commentators who have pointed to the pattern rather than treating each incident in isolation are not wrong. The league has the evidence it needs, has had it for some time, and the question of what it chooses to do with that evidence is going to say something definitive about what kind of institution it wants to be during the most important period of growth in its history. Here is where we land after one of the most chaotic nights in recent WNBA history. DiJonai Carrington walked into that arena with a reputation that was already under serious pressure. She walked out of it with her career genuinely at a crossroads, having committed 2 flagrant fouls on national television, having stormed off the court in a moment of complete professional collapse, having posted something on social media that turned what was already a bad night into something significantly more complicated. Sophie Cunningham, who took the hit that started all of this, who was mocked when she spoke up, who was told she was overreacting, stands completely vindicated without having said a single additional word. The entire basketball world that dismissed her warnings now has to sit with the fact that she was right about everything. The WNBA has a decision to make, and the clock is running. The fan base that the league has been working to build and retain is watching closely. The players who have spoken out about safety are watching closely. The media, which is covering every angle of this story in real time, is watching closely. Whatever happens next is going to tell you a great deal about who is actually in charge of this league and what values it is genuinely committed to defending. The hardwood is not a football field. The women playing on it deserve to play without fear of being blindsided by a player who has demonstrated repeatedly that she cannot or will not operate within the boundaries of professional sportsmanship. That is not a political statement. It is not a hot take. It is the most basic standard of accountability that any professional sports league owes to its players, its fans, and itself. The question is whether the WNBA is finally ready to enforce it.